It was midwinter. The snow was settling like feathers. The Queen sat at her window, which was lined with ebony, and she looked at the snow as she sewed, and she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell on the snow. And she looked at that and she thought, if I could have a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony, I would be so happy. And a little while later, she had a child who was as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony. And then she died. The king married a beautiful queen who was arrogant and selfish. Thus starts what story?
Snow White.
Snow White. It's Snow White, and it has the bits in that Disney didn't bother to include, as far as I'm aware. I don't think we get that at all. Because the king, as far as I'm aware, doesn't exist in the Disney film, but he is there in the Grimm's version of the story, which is called Little Snow White. And that's important because who is there at the beginning of a story, we will see, it's vital. If you want to understand how fairy tales are structured and what they're telling you, it's vital to look at that. There is a king there, but he hardly exists because the new queen who comes along dominates the story so much. So the masculine principle is there just almost as a shadow at the beginning, and then returns when the prince awakens her at the end. So as a story of fathers and daughters, Snow White maybe is not the best exemplar, and we're not going to look at it in any more detail than that, but you will see that the whiteness and the 3 drops of blood is a theme that runs through a number of fairy tales. So when you see some of these symbols and you think, well, what does that represent, and where does the blood come from, and what happens to the person where the blood comes from, that is a clue as to what realm you're talking about and what you might be dealing with. You'll find in fairy tales, it's a bit like listening to Wagner. Those of you who listen to Wagner, you get themes that sort of come in and go out, and come in and go out, little motifs. And we'll be looking at those today and abstracting those. And if you're tempted to go off and buy a book, if such exists, of how to interpret fairy tales, and you look up the symbols and say the symbol means this and the symbol means that, that's a limitation because it always has to be within the context of that tale. Then it will begin to make sense to you. So we're going to be looking at stories that particularly of fathers and daughters, and the reason I chose this theme was because generally in fairy tales the protagonist is male. And you probably notice that very, very few fairy tales name the protagonist, name the hero or the heroine. Snow White is an exception. Tom Thumb is an exception. Jack and his beanstalk is an exception. Usually it is just there was a boy, there was a girl, there was a prince, there was a princess. It's usually in that mode. And the reason for that is that they represent a principle rather than representing a person. It's always in that way. And when we tell these stories to children absolutely love them, almost universally. It's if you tell the story the right way, particularly if you tell it and don't read it, it captures the child, because the child, I would suggest to you, because we're in a spiritual environment here, the child still has some memories of where it comes from and still has some sense of there is more to the world than what I see outside. And when they get the story once upon a time, or in a place, east of the sun, west of the moon, or whatever, they immediately know, yes, that's right, there's another realm. And so these stories echo with the child and can awaken things within them. That's why it's so important that children have stories, and that they have stories that have these sublime meanings tucked away in them. And probably many of you here, when you were children, read myths, because people who are attracted to the spiritual life tend to get attracted to mythology, because you sense there's something in mythology. So the stories we're going to look at today, we're going to look at Capo Rushes, because it's a traditional English fairy tale, but you'll see it's in the Cinderella school. We're going to look at all kinds of fur, which comes from one of the Grimm fairy tales, and that will make up our morning. Prior to that, I'm going to use what I think is probably my favourite fairy tale of all time, which is the Goose Girl, to represent the stages of spiritual unfoldment that you often find in a fairy tale, told in different ways. You can see it very clearly in this story. So we'll take that as our map so we know where we're going. It's not so much a story of daughters and fathers, because a bit like Snow White, it starts just with the mother and the daughter as the focus. But we'll look at that not in so much detail, but to give you a sense of what's what. After lunch, we will look at Lear, because once you've been through the morning, and particularly having looked at Capo Rushes, you look at Lear and think, oh my goodness, it's a fairy tale. The structure is a fairy tale structure. Father, three daughters, which one loves him most, and so on, is a fairy tale setting. So whether there was or was not ever a Lear, Shakespeare used the fairy tale structure, and therefore you can look at that story as a mystery play. And I will be sharing with you towards the end of that Martin Ling's, who was a remarkably wise man, his interpretation of that particular story. And then we will finish with the Frog King, not the Frog Prince, the Frog King, which is the very first story in the Grimm pantheon, and it's also called Iron Henry. So you will recognise it, but it may be a little bit different to what you expect.
Shall we switch these lights off?
If you'd like, if that would help. So, what do you see in a fairy tale? And I'm going to start with this picture. So we have a picture here which is obviously of a forest, but what else do you see?
Some creature with tusks.
Some creature with tusks.
Snake, serpent.
Serpent.
Is that the crocodile?
There's a monkey.
It could be. There are lots of animals in there. So the point being here, I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but I want you to think about fairy tales like this. There's the obvious, and then there's the hidden. What about here?
Man on a horse and a dragon.
Man on a horse and a dragon, and then a face. So, which you see first is which you see first, but then there's something else there as well.
A cube.
This one, personally, I found more difficult at first. Clearly it's two trees.
Body of a woman.
Yeah, keep looking.
God in the tree.
Oh yes, a woman was facing that way.
Woman facing that way, and to our right.
Yes.
Oh, the man's face with a
Here.
beard. Yeah. Yes.
And we don't. Initially, we just see the trees, right? And then the other bit gets revealed to us, or not, as the case may be. So I want you to think about fairy tales in that way, that there is the obvious aspect to them. And you can, when you first read a story, there's so many strangenesses going on in any of the fairy tales you think about it. It's like, what is being represented through this? What was the consciousness that brought this into being? Because they were folk tales, they were tales told by folk, and they were for adults. They were not for children specifically. It's not to say children didn't listen to them, and they were prettified. Some of the versions of Sleeping Beauty, the father wants more from his daughter than father should reasonably want, right? And you have to go back to Greek myths to see the same thing, where you get the gods pursuing their own progeny or pursuing females that they have no right to. And again, we're not dealing with people, we're dealing with principles. So you can feel a little bit lost at the beginning. So I'm going to suggest to you that fairy tales, when we approach them in the right way, can in their own way be a key to spiritual awakening, or spiritual insight at least. That if you dwell with these stories, they can open up possibilities within you, because they speak directly to the intuition rather than to, you have to use the intuition to sort of penetrate into them, and the higher imagination to get a sense of what they might mean. And as I suggested earlier, we can take the Goose Girl as being a map of awareness, and we will go through each of these various different aspects. The Goose Girl sets off with her maid. She gets usurped by the maid. Her horse gets executed. She looks after the geese, and finally she gets back to her proper estate. So we can see this as being a spiritual journey. Initially, and these are the stages I've just gone through, initially the story starts with the mother. And the mother is sending her daughter off to a far country where a prince awaits her. And the mother says, take this with you, and takes her handkerchief, her white handkerchief, on which she drops 3 drops of her blood. And she gives that to the daughter so that the link with the mother is never lost. And the daughter sets off with the maid on her horse, but she's thirsty. And they're near a convenient river, and she goes and she drinks from the river. And when she drinks from the river, she loses the handkerchief. And she drinks 3 times from the river. And by the 3rd time that she's drunk from the river, she's confused about who she is. She's forgotten where she comes from, and the maid is sitting on her horse. And she now walks, and the maid now rides, until they come to where the prince dwells. And when they arrive there, the maid says, I'm the princess come to marry the prince. And who can say otherwise, because the princess has forgotten, and she's standing there holding the horse. And the powers that be in that town say, what about this woman? She's just a goose girl. So the Goose Girl goes out to look after the geese, and we can see a picture of her here. And the maid organises for the horse Falada to have its head cut off. And the head is put over the doorway. And the Goose Girl leaves every morning and returns every night. So we have the Goose Girl passing through this threshold at dawn and at dusk. And at those times, the horse speaks to her. And the horse says, I've not written it down here, the horse basically says to her, and always 3 times, you know, how your mother would grieve to have been forgotten, that you've forgotten who she is. Rudolf Steiner, the great Austrian savant and mystic, he said that what is being represented here is the threshold of consciousness at dawn and dusk. And probably all of us have had the experience of certain ideas come as we wake. And certain ideas come as we prepare for sleep. That there's an openness. And it's recognised within the Christian church with matins and with vespers that there are particular type of celebration is done at dawn and is done at dusk to represent the relationship with the divine at that point in time, because the veils, if you like, are thinner at that point in time. And our consciousness is less in the world because we've been in a dream state. We're slightly out of our normal state, and probably everyone in the room has experienced that to some degree or another. So what's represented in the story here is that as at that point, there's a better connection, and therefore those people who teach meditation say that's a good time to meditate. And you'll see that the Goose Girl is taking the geese. And she takes them out, and she has a companion called Conrad. And Conrad is there to help her look after the geese. And Conrad sees her hair, because she lets her hair down when she's out and on her own. And it's beautiful golden hair. And Conrad says, can I touch it? And the Goose Girl calls up a wind. And the wind blows Conrad's hat off. And he chases the hat. He chases after the hat. And he never gets to touch her hair. but he sees it. He's aware that it's there. And he tells the king, this is not any usual person. There's something special about her. I've seen it. And the Goose Girl will say nothing about who she really is. She's beginning to remember now, and she will say nothing about who she really is. But she does kneel in front of a stove, and the stove is made of iron. And there she tells about her story, because now she has remembered. She tells her story, and the king listens at the chimney, and he hears her story. Okay, so let's see what this might mean. You have the Goose Girl. She loses her sense of her origin. As she passes in and out the city, as she passes through stages of consciousness, she begins to get a memory of who she is, because she gets reminded by whatever is represented by the horse that's had its head taken off. And she goes out, and Conrad sees her hair, but he has no right to touch her hair. And she calls up a wind that blows the hat off, which he chases. But he is able to inform the king. She kneels in front of a stove, having a recognition of who she is. The king hears, and then she gets rightfully replaced. The horse will represent that bit of the higher consciousness that can just pinprick us with a sense of this is right, this is wrong. It can't tell you what to do, but it can tell you when what you're doing is not right. So it's like the voice of conscience, or it's that impression that comes in, and it can be there at the beginning and ends of the day when we're not in the throe of life. Conrad, I would suggest to you, and this is not the only interpretation, but Conrad, I would suggest to you, represents the ordinary everyday consciousness. Therefore, he's chasing his hat, head, thinking. So if you're looking with symbols, if you're looking at crowns and hats, it's almost always to do with thinking. And the wind, as you know, the airy realm, is thought. So he's always chasing his thoughts, because that's what the mind does. If we stop, most of us here probably have tried to meditate, and as you try to meditate, the thoughts come in. It's the very first stage of trying to learn to meditate, is you just get loads of thoughts come in. And that's Conrad, who chases the hat all the time. But it's not the wisdom of the Goose Girl. And that wisdom gradually has to come into being, and it comes about through an alchemical process. So there has to be the stove, there has to be a change that takes place with heat. There has to be a humility that she learns, and then the Goose Girl has to learn wisdom in a way, because she learned foolishness very early on by forgetting her origin. She learns her wisdom, and then the king, representing again a higher part of the mind, the king hears and can make sense of what is going on, and then she can be rightfully related to the prince. And because this is not a namby-pamby fairy tale, but a grim fairy tale, and the clue is in the name, the maid gets treated pretty badly in this. So we can see this as stages of awareness. The divine wisdom is hidden within us. We never lose that. And it's there, but we have to listen. We have to tune into it. We have to manage our geese. You can see these as the lower mind, the lower thoughts, the everyday thoughts. We have to manage those. If they crowd into our awareness, we'll never be able to tune into anything else. So being the Goose Girl is very symbolic in that sense. And ideas awaken spiritual truths, but Conrad is not able to receive those. The logical bit of your mind cannot make sense of these universal truths, because they're not logical. They're above logic. They rest in divine reason. They don't rest in human logic. So therefore, to logically try and work them out or scientifically measure them is impossible. So Conrad can know there is wisdom. Conrad can see the golden hair, but he can't touch it. It's not for him to touch. If he touches it, it's pulled down to his level, and he's forever chasing his hat. He can, however, inform the king. And a process has to take place in everybody's life, one way or another, for there to be a spiritual awakening, for there to be a growing sense of we're a spiritual being, not just a natural being, not just a creature of nature. So, and we mustn't forget Conrad, because he's absolutely necessary. Our mind is necessary. We can't get rid of our mind. And those meditative techniques that say meditation is about getting rid of your mind is like a contradiction in terms, because the very word meditation rests on the word mens in Latin, which is mind. So, to approach your mind by not having a mind is an impossible task, I would suggest. But Conrad can't be in charge. So we can see these stages now in this way. At first, and this is where children are, at first we just have a knowing. We know, we just know as children, if we do, we just know as children there's something more. There's more to life than meets the eye. We may lose that sense, as Wordsworth describes in his Trailing Clouds of Glory poem. But we can lose that. We have to regain it. And it can come to us through tradition. We can know that there are these spiritual traditions. We can be awakened to Hinduism and Buddhism and so on. But knowing those traditions exist doesn't mean that we have unfolded that inner certainty inside ourselves. So the first step, as seen from this map, the Goose map, is to acquire knowledge. We need to have knowledge in order not to be ignorant and not to know what we don't know. And if we manage our geese effectively, and then we manage Conrad effectively, then we gain understanding. So we're not chasing after ideas. We get what's behind and within those ideas. And finally, there is a point at which we wait, because you can't command this sort of insight. It comes when it comes. And if you read stories of people who are mystics, then they will tell of that point where a realization came. And indeed, in all of us, if we look at our life, particularly if we look backwards, we'll see points at which, oh yes, I had that idea then. I followed this intuition then. So, taking that map then, wisdom tales happen outside the ordinary. You can't use the ordinary to understand the extraordinary. And that you're told this at the beginning of every story. It's like the Ronseal advert. It's what it says on the tin. Because they always start like this. Far beyond the edge of the world, once upon a time, in a certain kingdom, in a certain land, in a little village, there lived. In olden times when wishing still helped. I love that one. In the high and far off times, and once on the far side of yesterday. And children love that. It's like, yeah, go for that. So let's look at why do we forget, and which is important to know. So if we see the female protagonist in this as generally representative of the soul, generally it represents the soul's journey, not the mind's journey per se, then why does the soul forget? And maybe in the stories of fathers and daughters we get an insight into that. So we're going to be looking at these tales, which, as I said earlier, represent fathers and daughters. So Kappa Rushes, which is an English fairy tale, All Kinds of Fur, and then the other name underneath, which I'll leave to somebody else to pronounce, which is a Grimm fairy tale. Lear, which you wouldn't necessarily think of initially as a fairy tale, and then the Frog King, which is the very first in the Grimm book, the Grimm collection. Why do we forget? We lose knowledge of the golden age. It's there in all the religious traditions. There was a golden age when, told in different ways, humanity lived with the Godhead. Humanity was at one with the divine. look at different religions, you'll get a different insight into it, but it's there universally in all the major religions. There was a golden age. And we can see that as being a time when the soul is unseparated from its divine origin, but it doesn't know itself. And when the soul comes to know itself, it eats of the tree of good and evil, it eats of the tree of knowledge, then it realizes its separation. And it's in the Christian tradition, it's the cherubim who go and say you can't re-enter, but that is a principle, because once you realize you are not the thing you thought you were totally part of, you then have to find out what you are, and then a journey starts. So one of the themes in fairy tales is this, and very often the first verse or the first two verses will be telling this in different ways. It's certainly there in Snow White with the pricking of the finger and because it's before the child comes. And the banishment is by the father, it's by principle, it has to happen, otherwise the soul would never know itself. So let's have a look at this story. A rich, it's important, look for the state at which the story starts. A rich man, right, had 3 daughters, and he asked them, how much do you love me? The way fathers sometimes think. And the first daughter says, as I love my life. And the second daughter says, better nor all the world. And the third daughter says, I love you as fresh meat loves salt, says she. And in other words, just right. And the father is outraged at this because he doesn't understand the response. The father is outraged at this and he immediately banishes her from the house. So she is sent forward on a journey and she is left with nothing but her fine clothes. So the 2 older daughters remain and she is on her own. And she goes out from the house and she comes to the riverside. And we've seen that already, remember, in the Goose Girl. She drinks of the river 3 times and she forgets. So when your protagonist ends up by where 2 realms meet, the watery realm and the earthy realm, then there's a change taking place. And she decides that she only has her clothes, that she decides she must hide who she is. People cannot know who she truly is. And she picks bulrushes and she hides her fine clothes in a cape of bulrushes, and she makes herself a cape and hood, and so she looks like a person who is very poor indeed. And she comes to a fine house, and you'll know in fairy tales there's some point in the story whether you come to a house, you come to a forest, or you come to a palace. Again, it's interesting to look at how it's described. So in this case, she comes to a house. And when she comes to the house, she has to cross the threshold. Again, we've seen thresholds before. Will she be let into this house? And they say to her, we don't need anybody. And she says, I will work for free. I will work for nothing. So they allow her into the house and she goes to the kitchen. And again, in many, many fairy tales, you will see the female protagonist ends up in the kitchen. And I don't go along with the idea this has been cleverly set up by society to make young girls think that they're better for nothing than being cooks to the prince. Okay? Because this is representing a principle of the soul, and the soul, all of us, have to spend our time at the hearth in the kitchen. The castle, very often you can see, because it's a stone structure, that you can very often think of it as representing the head. And when the Odyssey starts, when the story of Ulysses starts, very early on, you'll know he goes to the cave of Polyphemus, which is a cave, and it represents very much the consciousness in the skull. So if you arrive at a castle, it's very often talking about, well, that's the consciousness, everyday consciousness from which things begin. So she agrees to work for nothing and do menial work, and we find her in the kitchen preparing food. And the kitchen, of course, is alchemical. You take natural things, you combine them together, and you end up with something that is quite different, and you can't reverse it. So the symbolism of cookery and the symbolism of the fire and the symbolism of the chimney take us right back to ancient Egypt with Mart, who represents the hearth and the fireplace. And in the Greek tradition, it's Hestia and Vesper in the Roman tradition. So the hearth, and if those of you who visited India and you go into an Indian traditional Hindu home, you will very often find they will have a god or goddess of the hearth as well. It's represented as being important. Well, a great ball is to be held. This is a Cinderella type story, so you know there's got to be a ball. A great ball is to be held nearby, and the servants are invited to go. And as with Cinderella, she's not invited, or they ask her, but she says, no, not me. She's too tired. But she does go later, and she takes off her cape of rushes, and she has her fine clothing, and her hair is now revealed. So nobody is going to recognise her as the lowly kitchen maid. And when she arrives at the great ball, of course, she captures the interest, not to say the heart, of the prince. She goes to the ball 3 times, and I think you'll find this in most of the Cinderella stories, and indeed many stories. You'll find that 3 comes up, and when you see 3s, it's usually representing a completion, a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it shows that a process is going through. So the prince has to meet her 3 times. She has to show herself to the prince 3 times. She makes some gruel for the young master. Makes some gruel for the young master, they said to the cook. He's dying for the love of a lady. When she's gone, it's like he feels bereft. And so he wants some food. And the cook sets about making it when Kappa rushes. Now she's put her rushes back on when she returns. And what are you doing of, says she. What are you doing of, says Kappa rushes. I'm making some gruel for the young master, says the cook. He's dying for the love of a lady. Let me make it, says Kappa rushes. Well, the cook wouldn't at first, but then later she says yes, and Kappa rushes made the gruel. And when she'd made it, she slipped a ring into it on the sly before the cook took it upstairs. And the young man drank it, and then he saw the ring at the bottom.